Hello, science nerds. Today we're going to be talking about habitat fragmentation and habitat connectivity. So you might be familiar with habitat loss. All the tigers, elephants, orangutans, those are all losing a bunch of land all the time, and we're worried about them having enough habitat left. But habitat loss is not the only part of that problem. The other part of the problem is habitat fragmentation. So this is where you might have the same amount of land in a big area and in two separate smaller areas. But the two smaller areas are going to have less value for the animals because they can't move from one to another. So the individual animals are going to have less space to move around, less available resources to them, and less availability of mates. So the animals aren't going to be able to mate from one group to another, and they're going to have less genetic diversity within each of those populations because they're not able to mix. So this is why habitat fragmentation is really a big deal. The other part of it is what we call the edge effect. This is the fact that when you're in the inside of the habitat, in the middle of it, you're going to have fairly good habitat. But as you get closer to the edges, you're going to have outside influences affecting that habitat. So for example, on the edge of a forest, you might have other animals that are going to come in, like house cats that might start eating baby birds. You have invasive species that might start infiltrating the habitat on those edges. You have noise pollution, pollution from pesticides, fertilizers. All those things are going to be things that affect the edge of the habitat, but not so much the middle of the habitat. So when you have two segments of a habitat, you're going to have more edges than if it was all smushed together. So that's another concern with habitat fragmentation. Now, what causes fragmentation? Well, the main thing are physical barriers like roads, fences, agricultural fields, yards, like big open golf courses, logging, any sort of development that humans are doing can cause habitat fragmentation, anything that separates these two pieces of habitat. And the problems with that are really big concerns. So how do we solve habitat fragmentation? How do we make it not affect our animals so much? Well, we have to connect those habitat fragments back together, have animals able to move from one segment to another. We don't have to buy all of the land between it, but we need a corridor for them to be able to move from one part to another. So this is where wildlife corridors come in. So a wildlife corridor can be a strip of land, or it can even just be kind of stepping stones for the animal to move from one stepping stone to another as it gets to the next part of the habitat. And this increases the ability of animals to move from one segment to another, and they get access to those resources and mates that they are not able to get access otherwise. So these corridors can look like different things. One of the main ones that we have that's kind of just pre-built in the way that we design things right now is riparian buffers. So those are those green spaces that happen along streams and rivers where we have a certain amount of land that we have to have trees and plants and remain fairly natural around our streams and rivers to protect the water. This creates a natural area, a natural corridor for animals to move from one spot to another as long as it's connected to that riparian buffer with its habitat. Another thing we think about is road crossings that either go as underpasses or overpasses. You can have just little strips of land that are left natural to connect one place to another. You can also have something as small as just a green fence. If you have, instead of a normal fence, you put trees along the fence line, that can create ability for things like possums, raccoons, birds, squirrels, those things to be able to move from one part of the forest to another if they can just follow along that fence. Now, when you have a corridor, there are some concerns with how you're designing it. One thing is gaps. If you have a corridor trying to connect two different places, but there's a big gap in the middle, and the animals don't have a way to cross that gap, or you have some sort of natural or physical barrier like a mountain, or you have a big river that they can't cross, or even just a really big highway in the middle, then that gap is going to make that corridor worthless if the animals can't cross it. You also have to consider how long the corridor is and will the animals have access to the resources they need along that trip through the corridor. If it's a short corridor, it's not a big concern, but if you're trying to connect places that are fairly far apart, you need to make sure the animal has what it needs to survive that trip. While they're on that trip, it's more dangerous for them anyway, because they have more risk of predation, more risk of picking up parasites, especially really well-used corridors will have more parasites and diseases. And the quality of that habitat's usually not too good unless you have a really thick corridor because of that edge effect that we talked about earlier. And the type of corridor that you have really depends on the species that you're looking at. So if you're looking at a really small animal like a box turtle or a salamander, they may not be able to get up a curve on a road. So that might be a barrier that you need to overcome with either ramps or areas where the curbs are not included in the road or something along those lines. Or you could even make them go to a culvert or an underpass and have them cross there, which is another thing. If you have an animal and you have some sort of overpass or underpass, they're not going to necessarily know to cross there. So you have to have a fence or something to stop them and direct them to that safe crossing. If it's a turtle or a salamander, that can be as simple as just like a 1 foot tall fence. But if you're thinking about a deer, the deer is going to be able to jump really small fences and even pretty tall fences, and they'll jump it unless it is opaque and they can't see through it. So a 6 foot tall opaque fence if you have a deer, and just a little small fence if you have a salamander. Different concerns depending on the species you're looking at. Another concern is what type of corridor they need. If you're thinking about going around a road, small animals can use a little tiny culvert. Bigger animals might need an underpass, and some animals won't even use underpasses. Out west, the pronghorns are only antelope in North America. They don't like going underneath stuff, and so they will almost never use an underpass, but they will use an overpass if it's kind of clear and they can see to either side of them. So which species you're using is really important. And you do kind of have to pick a species that you're focusing on as your flagship species for building a corridor to be able to influence people. So you need to pick a species that is going to have the same concerns as the other species if you're planning on having a multi-use corridor that multiple species can use. When we are building the corridors, we need to make sure that we protect these corridors and have them wherever possible. We can leave edges on new areas that we're developing, have an area of forest along the edge of that new subdivision. We can have along the edges of agricultural fields, we can have corridors. And one person doesn't have to take on the whole responsibility. If you have multiple farmers, they can each put a small strip of corridor on their part of the land, but if it's next to their neighbors, then that doubles in size. So if you talk with people and get them to work together, you can get bigger corridors with people having to sacrifice less of their individual land. And when we're talking about corridors, again, it can be as simple as just a green fence. You can just have a line of trees, depending on the species you're talking about. And we also can think about things like getting rid of unnecessary fences and dams. Earlier this year, we removed a dam in Athens that was blocking a river passage up through one of the rivers in the Oconee, in the upper Oconee. It can be as simple as removing things that nobody's using anymore, like that dam. We can plant native wildflowers in medians and along roadways to help serve as a corridor for bees, butterflies, other small animals like that. And you yourself can do some of these changes, right? So you can take part of your backyard and leave it natural. Especially if you're next to some woods, just leave a little bit more of your yard natural and don't have a lawn in that part of your yard. If there's a fence that you're not using, take it down. You don't need to have it if you don't have a reason to have it. Have bird feeders and bird baths for our migrating animals, and have natural plants for our bees and butterflies. So those are all things that you can do to help improve the connectivity of the habitat in your area. Thank you, and have a great day.